She had 30 seconds to decide whether to open the door or die on the other side of it. Nadia Coleman stood pressed flat against the wall of her new apartment, one hand over her own mouth to keep her breathing quiet, the other wrapped so tightly around her phone that her knuckles had gone pale. On the other side of the door, a fist hammered against the wood in a rhythm she knew in her bones. Not the rhythm of a stranger. The rhythm of a man who believed, all the way down to the marrow, that a locked door was simply an inconvenience standing between him and something he already considered his. "Nadia, I know you're in there. Open the door." Derek's voice came through the wood, muffled but unmistakable, thick with the particular blend of rage and wounded entitlement she had spent 11 months trying to outrun. She had crossed a state line for this apartment. She had changed her number twice. She had told herself, every night for 2 months, that Seoul was far enough, that a new country with a language she was still learning, and a city of 10 million strangers would finally be the place Derek couldn't find. He had found her in 6 weeks. The handle rattled, then rattled harder. Then came a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, wood beginning to splinter at the frame, and somewhere underneath her fear, a small, furious voice reminding her that she had already run once, and she was not going to spend the rest of her life running. And then, through the door, she heard something else. A second set of footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, unbothered, the kind of footsteps that did not belong to someone afraid of anything at all. The rattling stopped. "Hey, besties, welcome back." If you've ever packed up your whole life into a car at 2 in the morning because staying one more night felt more dangerous than leaving, this one's for you. Stay close, because this is a long story, and I promise you, by the end, you are going to understand exactly why the quietest man in that hallway turned out to be the one thing Derek should have been afraid of all along. There's a lie people tell women who run from men like Derek. They say once you're far enough away, you're safe. Nadia believed that lie for exactly 6 weeks. What she didn't know yet was that safety was never going to come from distance. It was going to come from the last person in that building anyone would have called safe. But to understand how a Korean crime boss and a black woman from Atlanta ended up standing on the same side of a locked door, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the night Derek broke it. The night Nadia decided she'd rather disappear than stay. Nadia Coleman had been an interior architect in Atlanta for 6 years, the kind of quietly gifted professional who made other people's houses feel like homes while slowly forgetting what that felt like in her own. She met Derek Whitfield at a gallery opening, and for the first 8 months, he was the kind of attentive that friends called romantic and Nadia later would learn to call something else entirely. The control came slowly, the way it always does, disguised as care. He started picking her up from work because he worried about her driving alone at night. He started reading her texts because he loved her too much not to know who she was talking to. By the time Nadia understood what she was actually living inside of, she had already lost the language to describe it to anyone who might have helped her. Because on paper, in photographs, at dinner parties, Derek Whitfield was charming, successful, and devoted. The night she left, he had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a bruise in the shape of 4 fingers, over something as small as a missed phone call during a work trip. She did not scream. She did not cry. She packed one suitcase while he slept off the apology he always gave the next morning, and she drove through the night to her sister's place in another state. And she sat in that driveway for 20 minutes before she found the courage to knock, because some part of her still believed she deserved to be the kind of woman this didn't happen to. Her sister, Tony, did not ask a single question that night. She simply opened the door, pulled Nadia inside, and told her the only thing that mattered: you're not going back. It took 4 months of Derek's calls, 4 months of him showing up outside her work, 4 months of a restraining order that a man like Derek treated as a suggestion, before Nadia understood the terrifying truth. Distance within the same country was not distance at all, not to a man with his money and his patience. So she did the one thing she had never let herself imagine doing. She took a design consultancy contract with a firm expanding into South Korea, packed 2 suitcases instead of a life, and got on a plane to Seoul, telling almost no one, changing her number one final time, and promising herself this would be the last time she ever had to run. The building was clean, modern, and anonymous, exactly what Nadia had been looking for. The rental agent barely looked at her twice. The lobby had no doorman who might remember her face to a stranger asking questions. It was, she thought as she carried her last box down the hallway, the kind of place a person could finally become invisible in. She noticed the apartment next to hers on her second night, when a quiet, deliberate click of a heavy door closing came through the wall, not a slam, but a solid, weighted sound like something built to keep the world out rather than let anyone see in. She pressed her ear to the wall out of instinct and heard nothing else. No television, no voices, just a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of presence. The next morning, a scent drifted under her door into the hallway. Cedar and something colder underneath it, like winter air right before snow. It smelled expensive in a way that had nothing to do with money spent carelessly and everything to do with money spent on purpose. She told herself it was nothing. She had one rule now: mind your own business, do not be seen. She met him properly 4 days later in the hallway, when she was juggling a bag of groceries and lost her grip on a carton of eggs. It hit the floor between them in a mess of yolk and cracked shell, and she dropped to her knees apologizing before she even registered the man standing in front of her, because some instinct trained into her by Derek made apologizing to any tall, quiet, displeased man an automatic reflex now. When she finally looked up, she saw a man in his mid-30s, Korean, black hair cut with precision, wearing a suit that fit him like a second skin, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. He looked down at the eggs on his shoe, then at her, kneeling on the floor in the wreckage of her own groceries, and said only 2 words. "Be careful." It wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel either. It was simply a fact. Delivered the way a man delivers instructions to people who work for him. And then he stepped cleanly over the mess and disappeared into his apartment, leaving Nadia alone in the hallway with her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't fully name. She learned his name from the small brass plate on his mailbox in the lobby a week later: Jin Ho-Seok. The script was elegant, severe, exactly like the man himself. If you've ever had to build a whole new life out of one suitcase and a fresh start, drop the word "restart" in the comments so this finds someone else who needs it tonight. And hit subscribe, because what Jin Ho-Seok was about to do for a stranger he barely knew is going to stay with you long after this video ends. Nadia did not yet understand what kind of man lived behind that door, but the building told her in small, quiet ways if she paid attention. Men in dark suits who did not live there sat in the lobby some mornings, reading newspapers they never turned the page of. A sleek black car with windows too dark to see through idled at the curb some evenings, gone by morning. The building manager, a woman who smelled permanently of stale coffee, referred to apartment 7B only once, in passing, as belonging to Mr. Yu, and then changed the subject so quickly that Nadia understood without being told that some questions in this building were not meant to be asked twice. She built a careful rhythm designed for invisibility. She left for her design office before Jin left for wherever he went. She came home after his door had already closed for the evening. She never played music. She read late into the night in a silence so total it sometimes felt like the whole building was holding its breath along with her. One evening, returning from the market, she saw him in the hallway, speaking low and fast into his phone in Korean, his shoulders carrying a tension she had not seen in him before. When he ended the call and turned, his eyes landed on her with an intensity that felt almost physical, and for reasons she still could not explain, her hands went unsteady, and the same carton of eggs from before slipped from her grip a second time. This time, he caught it before it hit the ground. One hand, no wasted motion, the carton resting steady in his palm as if it had never been in danger of falling at all. He held it out to her without a word, and when their fingers brushed transferring it back, something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged out loud, though Nadia thought about it for 3 days afterward. It took Derek 6 weeks to trace her. Nadia would learn later, from a private investigator Jin quietly hired without ever telling her he'd done it, that Derek had gone through her sister's phone records, her old design firm's client list, a careless email from a coworker who didn't know better, piecing together a trail of breadcrumbs Nadia never knew she'd left. He landed in Seoul on a tourist visa 2 days before he showed up at her door. And by the time she heard his fist against the wood, he had already been standing outside her building for an hour, working himself into the exact fury she remembered from the worst nights of their relationship. "Nadia, I know you're in there. Open the door." She backed away from the door in silence, phone in hand, fingers too unsteady to dial anything at all. The handle rattled once, then harder. Then the frame began to splinter, and Nadia understood in that moment, the way she had understood it 100 times before in a different apartment in a different country, that a locked door had never once been enough to stop this man. And then the rattling stopped. She pressed her eye to the peephole and saw Jin Ho-Seok standing in the hallway, not looking at her door but at Derek, dressed simply in a black shirt and dark pants, leaning against his own doorframe with his arms crossed. A posture so relaxed it was somehow more frightening than any raised fist could have been. "What do you want?" Derek snarled, trying to recover the bravado that had gotten him this far. "This is a private conversation." Jin didn't answer immediately. He simply unfolded his arms and took one unhurried step forward, and something in that single step made Derek, a man a good 4 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier, take an involuntary step back. "You are being loud," Jin said. His voice was quiet, but it carried down the hallway the way cold carries through a cracked window. "Leave," Derek said, though his voice had lost its edge. "Who do you think you are?" "I'm not going anywhere," Jin answered. He tilted his head slightly, a small, almost curious gesture. That was not a request. Whatever Derek had planned to say next died somewhere in his throat. He looked from Jin's face to Nadia's door and back again, and for the first time in 11 months, Nadia watched the man who had controlled every hour of her life for 2 years look, unmistakably afraid. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his retreat loud and clumsy in a way his approach had never been, and Jin watched him go, perfectly still, until the elevator doors closed. Then he turned his head, and his eyes found the peephole, because he had known she was watching the entire time. Nadia knocked on Jin's door the next morning, because pride, or maybe survival instinct, made ignoring what he'd done feel like an admission of exactly how frightened she still was. He opened it already dressed, impeccable as always, and looked at her with an expression that gave nothing away. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for last night." "Will he return?" Jin asked. The question was clinical, careful, stripped of anything that might have sounded like concern, though Nadia would come to understand, much later, that this was simply how Jin Ho-Seok asked if someone he'd already decided to protect was safe. "I don't know," she admitted. "I moved here to get away from him. I don't know how he found me." Jin studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel like he could see straight through every mistake she had ever made, and was not judging her for a single one of them. "Hope is not a strategy," he said finally. It should have felt cold. Instead, over the following weeks, Nadia would come to understand it as the closest thing to a promise Jin Ho-Seok knew how to make. Because 2 days later, without ever telling her directly, he had a security consultant quietly install a new lock on her door, a peephole with a wider lens, and a discreet camera at the end of the hallway that had somehow, mysteriously, been broken for months and was suddenly, mysteriously, working again. He never mentioned it. She never asked him to explain it. That was the shape of whatever this was becoming between them, an entire conversation carried out in small, deliberate acts neither of them named out loud. Nadia learned, slowly and in pieces, what kind of man actually lived behind that door, not from him. Jin Ho-Seok did not explain himself to anyone, least of all a woman he had decided, for reasons even he did not examine too closely, was worth protecting. She learned it from the building itself, from the men who arrived and left at odd hours, from a delivery that included nothing but sealed manila envelopes exchanged in the stairwell, from the particular way people in the elevator lowered their eyes when he stepped inside. He ran an organization his own father had built, one that operated in the specific gray spaces between legitimate business and something far less legal, shipping contracts and real estate holdings that were, on paper, entirely clean, and underneath that paper, entirely his own private empire, built on discretion, loyalty, and a reputation for absolute, controlled ruthlessness that made men twice his size take involuntary steps backward in hallways. She should have been afraid of him. Some nights, lying awake in the silence of her apartment, she was. But she had spent 2 years being afraid of a man who wanted to own her, and there was something in Jin's particular stillness. The fact that he never once raised his voice to her, never once made her feel small the way Derek had made an art form of, that made her fear of him feel entirely different from the fear she had learned to live inside of before. One evening, taking out her trash later than she should have, she rounded a corner into the service stairwell and saw him with 2 other men in dark suits, handing a slim silver case to one of them, saying something low and sharp in Korean that made the other man bow his head. Jin's reflection caught hers in the stairwell's small window before she could retreat, and when he turned, the face she saw was harder than the one he ever showed her directly, the face of a man who had built an empire out of being underestimated. "You see too much," he said, when the other men had gone. "I didn't see anything," she said, the lie tasting like ash. "Lying is also not a strategy," he answered. "Not with me." He reached out slowly, and she flinched before she could stop herself, an old reflex Derek had trained into her that she hated herself for even now. Jin's hand stopped in the air between them, and something in his expression shifted, not offense, but a kind of quiet, careful understanding. "I am not him," he said. It was the first time he had ever referred to Derek directly, and the certainty in his voice landed somewhere Nadia had not let anyone reach in a very long time. Derek did not disappear after that night in the hallway. Men like Derek rarely accept a single loss as final. He spent the following weeks building a case, in his own twisted logic, that Nadia had been coerced into cutting him off, that some dangerous foreign man had manipulated her against her own family. And he brought that case, along with a private investigator of his own and a lawyer willing to file whatever paperwork he paid for, directly to the local authorities, filing a report alleging that Nadia was being held against her will by a man connected to organized crime. It was, Jin would later admit to her, a clever move, precisely because it was almost true enough to be dangerous. An investigation opened. Detectives came to the building. For 3 tense days, Nadia sat in a small gray interview room answering questions about her relationship with a man she had known for only a few months, terrified that Derek had found a way to weaponize the one thing that had actually made her feel safe since she'd arrived in Seoul. What broke the case apart was not Jin's money or his influence, though he had both in abundance. It was Nadia herself, sitting across from a detective who had clearly expected a frightened, coerced woman, and instead found someone who laid out, calmly and in full detail, 2 years of bruises, restraining orders Derek had ignored, phone records showing his obsessive tracking of her location for months, and a private investigator's paper trail proving he had crossed an ocean specifically to find a woman who had done nothing, but asked to be left alone. The detectives believed her. Derek's own investigator, questioned separately, admitted under pressure that he had been hired specifically to build a narrative, not uncover a truth. Within a week, it was Derek facing an international harassment complaint, his visa flagged, his return to Seoul barred, and Nadia realized, sitting in that gray room for the last time, that she had spent 2 years believing she needed someone else to save her, when what she had actually needed all along was to finally be believed. Jin was waiting in the lobby when she came out. He didn't ask how it went. He simply looked at her face and seemed to already know. "You did that," he said, "not me." "You made it possible for me to stay long enough to do it," she answered. It was the first time either of them said something that sounded less like caution and more like the truth. What followed was not a whirlwind. Jin Ho-Seok did not sweep Nadia into a life of danger and diamonds the way the building's rumors might have suggested to anyone watching from the outside. What followed was slower and stranger and far more ordinary than either of them expected it to be. He started leaving for work after her some mornings, a small deliberate shift in a rhythm he had never varied for anyone before. She started leaving her door unlocked during the day, an act of trust that would have seemed unthinkable 4 months earlier. He taught her, without ever explaining why it mattered so much to him, how to properly hold a knife when she offered to cook for him one evening. A domestic scene so at odds with the man from the stairwell that she nearly laughed out loud, watching him carefully arrange vegetables on a cutting board like it was a task requiring the same precision as anything else he did. She learned that Jin had inherited his position the way some people inherit grief, without ever being asked if he wanted it. At 19, when his father was killed in a rival dispute that left him the only person in his family capable of holding what remained together. She learned that the coldness the world saw was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of too much of it, carefully controlled because the alternative, in his world, got people killed. She learned that he had never, not once in 15 years of running an empire built on fear, brought a woman into his apartment, let alone let one see him in the stairwell handling the actual business of his life. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you," he told her one night, several months into whatever they had quietly become, sitting on her small balcony with 2 cups of tea neither of them had finished. "You already are," she said. "You just don't believe it yet." A year after the night Derek's fist first hit her door, Nadia stood on that same small balcony, looking out over a city that had once felt like nothing but a hiding place, and now, somehow, felt like home. Her design consultancy contract had turned into a permanent position, one she had built entirely on her own reputation, in a city where nobody knew her as anything other than exactly who she chose to be. Her sister Tony had visited twice, had sat across from Jin at dinner with the particular suspicion of an older sibling who had seen too much, and had left, after the second visit, telling Nadia quietly in the airport that she had never seen her look so unafraid. Jin never asked Nadia to become part of the world he had inherited, and she never asked him to leave it, because both of them understood, in the specific unspoken language they had built together, that some things could not simply be walked away from, only carried more carefully. What he did instead, slowly, over the following year, was begin restructuring the parts of his organization that could be restructured, moving legitimate shipping and real estate holdings further into the light, keeping the parts that could not yet be undone contained, controlled, and as far from Nadia's life as he could manage. It was not redemption in the way stories usually promise it. It was something quieter and more honest than that. A man choosing, every single day, to be someone worth trusting, the same way Nadia had spent every day since Seoul choosing to be someone who no longer flinched. Derek never returned. The harassment complaint followed him back to the United States, cost him the job that had funded his obsession, and the last Nadia ever heard of him came secondhand, through her sister, a distant rumor that he had moved to another city entirely, chasing some new version of the control he had lost with her. She did not think about him often anymore. That, more than anything else, was how she knew she had actually gotten free. 2 years after the eggs first hit the hallway floor, Jin Ho-Seok stood in that same corridor in a suit as immaculate as the one he'd worn the day they met, waiting for Nadia to come out of her old apartment one final time, the one she was finally giving up, because she had moved permanently into his, into the life they had quietly built together without ever making a single grand announcement about it to anyone. She came out carrying one small box, the last of her things, and Jin took it from her without being asked, the way he had taken the falling egg carton from her hands months earlier, no wasted motion, nothing dropped. "You know," she said, "this is the second time you've caught something I was about to lose." Jin looked at her for a long moment, something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth, the kind of expression the rest of the world never got to see. "I intend to keep catching them," he said, "for as long as you'll let me." She smiled and did not flinch when he reached for her hand this time. And in a hallway that had once smelled like fear and cedarwood and cold smoke, the two of them simply walked together toward whatever came next. And that's the story, besties. In a world full of women told to run and keep running, this one's about a woman who finally stopped, and a man dangerous enough to make sure she never had to run again. If this one got you, do 3 things right now. Hit like. Comment the one line from this story that hit you hardest. And subscribe, because we've got so many more stories exactly like this one coming. And if you're wondering whatever happened to Derek Whitfield, wondering whether a man like that ever really learns his lesson. Some people don't change. They just run out of places willing to let them hide behind someone else's fear. We'll see you in the next one.